So the sixth and last speaker is Marcel Nedd, who's also with us connected. Yes, I can see him. Marcel graduated in Bachelor in Physics and a Master degree in Environmental Sustainability and Green Technology. He has worked on sustainable energy and development projects in the solar PV industry. He joined the University of Strathclyde in 2014, and his research explores the future of energy response on the backdrop of the changing power landscape and reducing inertia in Great Britain. His work has contributed to a number of commercial and policy-focused collaborations with members of the power industry, generators, system operators, regulators. Marcel is interested in power systems and in particular system operability and security of supply. It's a pleasure to have you here, Marcel. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully you can all see my screen.
We do, thanks.
Yes, so I am Marcel Nedd, and I'll be talking a bit about metrics for determining frequency stability limits of a power system.
Marcel, we cannot hear you now.
One moment. Sorry, some technical issues. Do you have my video? Maybe you want to just play that. I'm not sure what's going on.
If you prefer, I can definitely play the video. Would you like that?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
Please.
No, actually, I don't have the 6th video. I'm not sure if you have sent it to us.
Okay. Okay. I have a video. Hopefully that works.
We still cannot hear. When you share the screen, make sure you tick the option to share computer sound.
Okay, sorry. Hopefully you can hear me now properly.
Yep.
Right, so the power systems today are tending towards lower inertia, and there's an increasing penetration of non-synchronous dispatch. And this often leads to the need to curtail renewables so that power imbalances can be contained within stability limits. We can use metrics to guide operational policies and to understand and quantify factors around frequency stability limits. And today I'll be talking about 3 metrics using the British power system as a case study. But first, I'll give a bit of background on frequency management in the British power system and briefly introduce the model that was used in the paper. The power system must be secured so that a normal loss of 1.32 gigawatts would not cause frequency to exceed plus or minus 0.5 hertz. And while for an infrequent event, that also means that if there's an event of 1.8 gigawatts, frequency should avoid a deviation outside of plus or minus 0.5 hertz for more than 60 seconds. And the image on the left illustrates these frequency limits. In addition, the rate of change of frequency, the rock-off, must be managed so that it doesn't result in unintended tripping of loss of mains protection. And this requirement imposes a rock-off limits based on the settings of protection devices. These settings are 1 hertz per second with a window of 500 milliseconds, while some existing synchronous generators are permitted to use a 0.5 hertz per second setting. That said, the effective limits in Britain is currently 0.125 hertz per second. And that's because we still have about 2 gigawatts of distributed generation on the old settings that are due to be updated by 2022. So containing a power imbalance within frequency and rock-off limits depends on the energy responses available. These responses can be split into 2 categories: those that are inherent, like inertia and sensitivity of demand to frequency changes, and those that are dispatchable, like frequency response, illustrated on the left. The current existing frequency responses in Britain are primary, secondary, high, and enhanced frequency responses, where primary and secondary are for low frequency events, while high frequency response is the equivalent for high frequency events, and an enhanced response is a fast response service that is used for both low and high frequency events. The single boss model is shown on the left, and it aggregates elements of the power system based on how they respond to frequency events. The model includes synchronous and non-synchronous power generation grouped into flexible and inflexible. The flexible generation elements represents those sources of power in feed that can respond to frequency events via a controller action, whereas the inflexible generation elements are those that do not. The model also includes elements to simulate power imbalances via loss events. That's the loss of load and loss of in-feed elements, as well as the inclusion of synchronous compensation and frequency responses. So we've seen this event shown on a couple of the slides today, but this is the August 9th event that happened in the Bukhsh power system. And we used the data from this event to validate the model for the GP power system. And the results are what you can see on that graph there. In replicating the event, we tuned the default assumptions for the speed of delivery of dynamic primary response. And that was based on the discussions with industry experts that in reality, the providers slightly outperform their statutory requirements. Aside from that, all the other responses that were modeled were done using the definitions in their compliance. And using the model, we then went on to consider 3 metrics: synchronous, system non-synchronous penetration limits, critical inertia, and containment component metric. In this study, we considered the SNSP limits for Britain, so that's a system non-synchronous penetration limit. And the SNSP is defined by the expression on the left. This one right here. And for a given level of demand, the penetration of non-synchronous in-feed was increased until a 1.32 gigawatt loss could not be contained within stability limits. And that was based on these scenarios over here. So the loss was a normal loss of in-feed for 1320 megawatts for different rock-off limits. And they correspond to the plots on the graph. Then we repeated the variation of the penetration limits and then testing to see if stability of the frequency event could be contained for a range of demand values across 20 to 70 gigawatts. And the results were shown here. What you can see from this is that the black line is that point beyond which the event could not be contained. So to clarify, anything that's underneath here would be fine, and anything that's above here is not for the black line, and then same for the red and blue line that incidentally overlaid each other. One of the things that you can sort of pick out from this is that by comparing the three scenarios, once we shift from the old Waqquas settings of 0.125 hertz per second to the newer settings, the SNSP limits shifts upwards. And that's because the limiting factor for that limit is no longer dominated by Waqquas, but it's now dominated by your frequency reserve, essentially. The SNSP limit is a useful metric, but it is limited because it doesn't account for variations in energy responses, such as more or less inertia or more or less frequency response. So for instance, if we took a particular point on the plot here, 40 gigawatts of demand with around 13 gigawatts of non-synchronous dispatch, and you had less inertia, then you would no longer be, you'd be overestimating what the system could have actually done based on the exact results of this limit. We can do the same thing for the critical inertia scenarios. And here, this critical inertia is defined by the expression down here. And while this allows for the variations in inertia that the SNSP doesn't, it doesn't allow for variations in the frequency response. And the results from both of these two metrics are fairly comparable. So we'll move on to the alternative approach. So another way you could do it is by looking at the containment component metric, where frequency stability during an imbalance is split into two components, the Waqquas components and the frequency components. The Waqquas component is determined using equation 3, and that calculates an instantaneous Waqquas based on the imbalance and system inertia due to the operational dispatch, which gives you an inertia based on the expressions down here. Should point out that because equation 3 calculates inertia, an instantaneous Waqquas, it does actually give a conservative result, but you can use this directly as an indicator as to whether your scenario would be able to contain significant power imbalance within your Waqquas limits. Once the instantaneous Waqquas is deduced, then the likelihood of containment within frequency conditions can be investigated by using expressions that link the instantaneous Waqquas, the loss risk, and the frequency response reserve. And the plots on display illustrate this for the GB power system, where the simulations were done using the single boss model and the assumption that enhanced frequency response was the sole frequency response service available for both infrequent loss and normal loss events. In this case, for a given instantaneous Waqquas, the amount of reserve required to contain a loss within frequency limits is determined and repeated for a range of loss risks and instantaneous values to arrive at the surfaces shown in the plots. That expressions are mapped to these surfaces to give equation 9 for infrequent loss events and equation 10 for normal loss events. Using the equations 3, 9, and 10, that is the equations for the Waqquas containment and the components for the frequency containment, you can check whether a loss or power imbalance can be contained within Waqquas and frequency limits for a wider range of scenarios in comparison to the previous two metrics. In addition, we could also use the relationships to determine what is needed to make a scenario more compliant across 3 dimensions of inertia, loss risk, and frequency response reserve. To conclude, both SNSP and critical inertia are useful indicators, but they do neglect variations in energy responses. The amount of non-synchronous dispatch itself is not an inherent limitation to containment within frequency stability limits. Instead, the 3 main factors are actually the energy responses available, the loss that is experienced, and the stability limits. And the containment component metric considers these factors. going forward, future work would include incorporating demand sensitivity into the containment component metric, as well as static response, while also providing methods to exchange between different types of frequency response services. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. Other questions? By the other speakers as well, if they wish to be unmuted, just let me know. There's a question in the question and answer panel. What would be a summary of the metrics to be considered for the GP case, for the Great Britain case?
So I think the best thing to answer with that is that you could use the SNSP limits and the critical inertia limits as sort of your first pass indicators as to whether or not you need to redispatch your system. But then if you had slight changes to the initial conditions of the scenario that determined those limits, they would no longer be valid. And that's where the containment component metric would then come in, because that considers a wider, that would allow you to consider a wider range of variations to initial conditions of scenarios, such as variations in inertia and the amount of responses available. I should probably add that it's not, you know, these metrics aren't exclusive to the British power system. You could apply it to any other power system with similar characteristics. Got another question. A metric ought to be useful as a simple guide to the operator on whether the operating condition is okay. The SNSP limit is already used on the island of Ireland. How might such a metric have helped in the August 9th events in GB last year? Right, so briefly, the event was, we had an instance where there was some problems with a wind plant, and that triggered the loss of output from the wind plant itself. And then there was a knock-on effect of then causing loss of mains to respond because of vector shift and rock-off settings. And then as frequency carried on falling, other generators started dropping offline until we eventually hit the low frequency demand disconnection settings. And to further add to the event, we had another part of a generator coming offline after that. The details of it are in the Ofgem's reports and the SO's reports on their websites. So in terms of the metric itself, well, if they had considered any one of those metrics, then they would likely have dispatched the system to be able to contain the loss within the rock-off limits. However, it's debatable as to how they would have approached that, given that the SQSS itself wasn't entirely clear on, well, from their perspective, I guess, wasn't entirely clear on specifically what they wanted to do. So I expect that there'll be some more certain wordings on what the SO needs to do in terms of containing the events going forward.
Thanks a lot for contributing to the discussion, for answering these questions. We are perfectly on time. This is the end of the session. If there are no more questions. Yeah, there is a short comment.
Yes, so I'll read that. Just to note that both the island of Ireland and GB have distributed generation protected by loss of mains protection based on measured rock-off. Both systems have quite low inertia, so rock-off settings are important. Yes. And that's why they end up imposing rock-off limits.
Thanks again, and thank you all the speakers for participating to this session. Despite the unusual setting, I think it went well, and the discussion was fruitful. This is the end of the session, and so I wish you a nice continuation at the PSCC conference.